The auctioneer's voice, a gravelly rasp honed by decades of shouting over diesel engines and nervous cattle, barely carried over the biting November wind. It whipped across the frozen mud of the Henderson farmstead, rattling the loose tin on the machine shed and making the assembled farmers pull their canvas jackets tighter. They weren't here for comfort, they were here for bargains, vultures circling the carcass of a failed dream. I stood at the back of the crowd, my hands shoved deep in my pockets, the worn denim of my jeans stiff with cold. My name is Frank Miller. In 1972, at 26 years old, I was already an old man in spirit. Saddled with 160 acres, my father had worked himself into an early grave for, and a mortgage that felt like a tombstone chained to my ankle. Most of the good equipment had already gone. A decent John Deere 4020, its green paint faded but its engine sound sold for a price that made my stomach clench. A New Holland baler, a few years old but well maintained, was snapped up by a man from the next county. Now we were down to the dregs, the scrap iron, the mechanical skeletons that littered the fence rows of so many farms like monuments to broken promises. All right, boys, what am I bid on this? This fine piece of American iron, the auctioneer, a man named Gus, bellowed. His gaze swept over a hulking yellow beast parked in the weeds behind the barn. It was a bulldozer, an old one. An Alice Chalmers HD6, I reckoned, from the mid-50s, 10 tons of neglect and abandonment. One of its tracks was half buried in the mud, a steel link snapped and curled back like a broken tooth. The blade was scarred and bent, its cutting edge worn into a wavy line. Rust bled from every seam, staining the faded yellow paint with long weeping streaks of orange. The seat was gone, just a rusty pan open to the sky, and the engine cowling was missing, revealing a massive 6-cylinder diesel engine caked in a half-inch of greasy, dirt-caked grime. A low chuckle rippled through the crowd. "That thing run, Gus," someone shouted. "Runs on hopes and dreams, son," Gus shot back, never missing a beat. "Engines free, we're told, pony motors seized up tighter than a banker's wallet, but the big diesel turns, selling it as is, where is. You haul it, you own it. Let's start the bidding for scrap value. Who'll give me $500? $500 for 10 tons of steel." Silence. The wind howled. Nobody moved. $500 was a week's wages for some of these men, and a whole lot of work to cut it up and haul it to the scrapyard in Cedar Rapids. "Come on now, boys, don't be shy. The blade alone is worth that." $400. "Can I get 400? More silence. I watched the men. I saw the dismissal in their eyes. They saw a liability, a junker, and I saw that would cost more to move than it was worth. But I saw something else. I saw the straight, unbowed frame. I saw the massive, overbuilt final drives. I saw the Detroit diesel engine, a 371, a legendary power plant known for being noisy, leaky, and tough as coffin nails. My father had a smaller one in an old irrigation pump, and he used to say you could run it on kerosene and mud if you had to. I saw potential, buried under decades of rust and ruin. At the back of my property, there were 40 acres of swampy, wooded bottomland. It was a tangled mess of cottonwoods, willows, and rocks the glaciers had left behind. My father had always called it the devil's acreage, worthless for anything but hunting raccoons. But the soil underneath, if I could ever get to it, was black gold. Rich, deep loam that had been washing down from the hills for 10,000 years. Clearing it with my old Farmel M was impossible. Hiring it done would cost a fortune I didn't have. But a dozer could change everything. "Looks like Frank's found himself a new toy," a voice sneered beside me. I didn't have to turn to know it was Dale Peterson. Dale's farm bordered mine to the west. He was everything I wasn't. Loud, arrogant, and swimming in bank debt. While I was patching up my father's 20-year-old International Harvester 560, Dale had just taken delivery of a brand new John Deere 4630, complete with a Soundguard cab, air conditioning, and an 8-track tape player. He'd bought it with a loan from the Farmers Trust, the same bank that held my mortgage, and sent me polite but firm letters every month. "It's a lot of steel, Dale," I said, my eyes still fixed on the dozer. "It's a lot of junk, Frank," he scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. "You ought to be looking at that old corn planter over there. Something you can actually use, instead of dreaming about moving mountains with a rust bucket." Gus was getting desperate. All right, scrap price it is. Who'll give me $200? $200, boys, you haul it away. A man from the scrapyard raised a hesitant finger. 200. I got 200. Who'll give 225? 225. My heart started to pound. This was it. It was a stupid, reckless gamble. My wife, Mary, was already stretching every dollar until it screamed. We were eating more beans and potatoes than I cared to admit. $200 could buy us groceries for a month, maybe fix the leaky roof on the barn. But that swamp, that black earth. 250, I said. My voice was quiet, but in the lull between gusts of wind, it cut through the air. Every head turned to look at me. Dale Peterson let out a short, barking laugh. You're kidding me, Miller. What in God's name are you going to do with that thing? I ignored him, keeping my eyes on Gus. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He knew my situation. Everyone did. I've got 250 from Frank Miller. Who'll go 275? 275. Want to bid it up, boys? The scrapyard man shook his head and dropped his hand. He wasn't going to get into a bidding war over a dead machine that had to be hauled 30 miles. Gus scanned the crowd one last time. $250 once, twice, sold, to Frank Miller for $250. He slammed his hand down on his ledger. A wave of murmurs went through the crowd. It wasn't the money, it was the sheer foolishness of it. I felt their judgment like a physical weight. Dale clapped me hard on the shoulder, a gesture that was more mockery than congratulations. Well, Frank, you finally bought yourself a piece of equipment bigger than mine, he said, a wide, smug grin on his face. Too bad it'll never run. Let me know if you need to borrow my new deer to drag that anchor to the scrap man. I'll only charge you $100 an hour. He walked away, laughing, joining a group of other farmers who were already shaking their heads and looking my way. I didn't care. I walked toward my new purchase, the frozen ground crunching under my worn work boots. Up close, it was even more intimidating. The steel tracks were wider than my torso. The blade towered over my head. I placed a hand on the cold, rusty engine block. It was freezing, dead, a monument of cold iron. But I could feel something. A flicker of a promise, a chance. This wasn't just about a machine. It was about a choice. The world was changing fast. Men like Dale were betting the farm on new technology and easy credit. They were chasing bigger yields, bigger acreage, bigger debt. I was trying to hold on to what I had, to honor my father's way of doing things, own what you have, owe no man, and trust in your own two hands. This 10-ton pile of junk was my bet. A bet on the old ways. A bet on myself. Before we go any further with this story, I have to ask you folks watching. Have you ever taken a chance on something old and broken? A car, a piece of equipment, maybe even a piece of land that everyone else said was worthless? Let me know down in the comments what it was and how it turned out for you. I'd sure like to hear about it. Getting the Dozer home was the first battle in a long war. It sat 3 miles away, a dead weight in a dead farmer's field. It hadn't moved under its own power in at least a decade, and its sheer mass was a logistical nightmare. Dale's offer to tow it for $100 an hour, meant as a joke, was an insult I wouldn't entertain. I would do this myself. The first problem was the broken track. I spent a full day in the freezing mud with a sledgehammer, a cutting torch I borrowed from a neighbor, and a collection of pry bars big enough to move a house. The master pin was rusted solid. I heated it cherry red with the torch until it glowed like a malevolent eye in the grey afternoon, then hammered on it with the sledge until my arms felt like jelly and my ears rang. Finally, with a groan of tortured metal, it gave way. I managed to drag the broken ends of the track together using my old Ford F-250 and a logging chain, and jury-rigged a repair with a thick steel plate and some grade 8 bolts I'd scrounged from my coffee can of hardware. It was an ugly temporary fix, but it would hold long enough to get it home. The second problem was towing it. My truck, a reliable 68 with a 390 V8, was strong, but not that strong. I knew I'd tear the transmission right out of it, trying to pull 10 tons of dead steel up the slightest grade. The only other machine I had with enough guts was the Farmall M, my father's pride and joy. It was a 1949 model with a narrow front end and no hydraulics to speak of, but its engine was a low-revving powerhouse built for torque. The journey home was a slow, grinding procession. I had the Farmall in its lowest gear, the engine screaming at full throttle, the big rear tires digging into the gravel road. The Dozer was a reluctant beast, its tracks groaning and popping, the steel grousers chewing up the road surface. I could feel the strain through the seat of the tractor, a deep, vibrating hum that traveled up my spine. Every slight incline felt like a mountain. We moved at a walking pace, a parade of old, struggling iron that drew stares from everyone who passed. Dale Peterson drove by in his shiny new pickup, slowed down just long enough to shake his head with a pitying smirk, and then sped off, leaving me in a cloud of dust. It took me 6 hours to cover 3 miles. By the time I finally dragged the Alice Chalmers into my yard and parked it next to the barn, darkness had fallen and I was bone-tired and covered in grease. Mary came out onto the porch, a silhouette against the warm light from the kitchen. She didn't say a word, just watched me shut down the heaving, steaming Farmall. Her silence was heavier than any criticism. For the next 4 months, that Dozer became my obsession. The farm work still had to be done, fences mended, the old combine prepped for the next harvest. But every spare minute, evenings, weekends, the rare rainy day, was spent in the barn with that machine. I draped a heavy canvas tarp over the entrance to block the winter wind, ran a single extension cord out for a drop light, and began the methodical process of disassembly. The first order of business was the pony motor. It was a small, 2-cylinder gasoline engine designed to start the massive diesel. It was, as Gus the auctioneer had said, seized solid. Water had gotten into the cylinders and rusted the pistons to the cylinder walls. It was a boat anchor. I spent a week trying to free it with penetrating oil, heat, and brute force, but it was no use. I unbolted the whole assembly, a greasy 200-pound lump, and set it aside. I'd have to find another way to start the diesel. That meant I needed to focus on the big engine itself. The Detroit 371. I drained the oil, which came out like black sludge. I pulled the valve cover, a heavy piece of cast iron, and was relieved to see that things looked relatively clean inside. No major rust, just old, thick oil. I spent days cleaning, scraping gaskets, scrubbing parts in a bucket of gasoline until my hands were raw, using wire brushes to get years of caked-on grime off the engine block. The smell of solvent and old grease filled the barn and clung to my clothes. The real trouble started when I pulled the injectors. The third one was stuck fast. When I finally got it out with a slide hammer I'd fabricated, the tip was mangled. Worse, when I peered down into the cylinder with a flashlight, I saw the problem. A hairline crack in the cylinder head right next to the injector port. It was the likely reason the machine had been parked all those years ago. A compression leak that would have made it impossible to start and robbed it of power. Finding a cylinder head for a 20-year-old Detroit diesel in rural Iowa in 1972 was like hunting for unicorns. I started with the local tractor salvage yard. The old man who ran it, a crusty fellow named Earl, just laughed when I told him what I was looking for. A head for a 371. Son, I ain't seen one of them in 10 years. People junked them things, went to the new Cummins or Cats. I spent my evenings on the phone, the old black rotary dial clicking with each number. I called yards in Des Moines, Omaha, Kansas City. I burned through a pocketful of dimes at the payphone in town, leaning against the cold brick wall of the general store, scribbling notes on the back of a feed bill. Most calls were a dead end. A few guys had parts, but they wanted a king's ransom for them. One yard in Missouri had a head, but they wanted $300 for it, more than I'd paid for the whole machine. The community was watching my folly unfold. When I went to the diner for coffee, the conversations would stop for a moment. I'd get sympathetic nods from the old-timers and condescending smirks from the younger guys like Dale. "Heard you're rebuilding that old Alice, Frank," one would say. "Gonna have it ready for spring planting?" The question was always followed by a few chuckles. They called it Frank's Folly or Miller's Monument. My reputation in the county was transforming from the quiet son of a respected farmer to the local eccentric wasting his time on a pile of junk. The pressure was immense, a constant low-grade humiliation. Mary did her best to support me, but I could see the worry in her eyes every time I came in from the barn, hands blackened with grease, to tell her about another dead-end phone call or another part that needed replacing. Finally, I got a lead. A trucking company over in Illinois was auctioning off some old equipment, including a generator powered by a 371. It was a long shot, but it was the only one I had. I borrowed my neighbor's stock trailer, hooked it to my F-250, and drove the 4 hours east on a Saturday, praying the whole way. The generator itself was beat to hell, but the engine looked promising. I got into a bidding war with a scrapper and ended up paying $150 for it, money we desperately needed for seed corn. But when I got it home and pulled the head, it was sound. No cracks, no warps. It was the single most beautiful piece of cast iron I had ever seen. After weeks of painstaking work, lapping the valves, installing the new head with a fresh gasket, timing the injectors just right, the moment of truth arrived. I had bypassed the pony motor issue by devising a crude but effective direct start system. I took the starter from the generator engine, a massive 24-volt Delco Remy, and fabricated a mounting bracket to bolt it to the bell housing of the Dozer's engine. I wired it up to 2 heavy-duty truck batteries I'd bought on credit from the Napa store. It was a cold morning in early March. The air was still, and the rising sun cast long shadows from the barn. Mary stood on the back porch, her arms crossed, a nervous expression on her face. I took a deep breath, climbed up onto the Dozer's track, and leaned into the operator's station. I checked the fuel line, hit the makeshift primer pump I'd installed, and then pushed the starter button. The big starter groaned, straining against the immense compression of the diesel. The engine turned over slowly, reluctantly. 1 revolution, 2, a puff of white smoke coughed from the straight pipe exhaust stack. I held the button down, the engine spun faster. Chug, 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 a cloud of grey smoke now. Then a single cylinder fired. Kabang! The sound echoed off the barn wall, another one caught. Kabang, chug, kabang! The whole machine shuddered. I gave it a little throttle, and then it happened. With a deafening roar that shook the very ground beneath my feet, the Detroit diesel roared to life. A massive plume of black smoke erupted from the stack, blotting out the morning sun before settling into a rhythmic, loping idle. Lope-a-lope, lope, lope. It was the ugliest, loudest, most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The vibration traveled from the steel deck plates through the soles of my boots and into my very soul. It was alive. I looked over at Mary. A slow, wide grin spread across her face. It was the first time I'd seen her truly smile in months. In that moment, all the scorn, all the doubt, all the back-breaking work, it all became worth it. Frank's folly had a heartbeat. The timing couldn't have been better. The spring of 1973 was the beginning of the great grain boom. Spurred by massive sales to the Soviet Union, corn and soybean prices shot through the roof. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, was telling us to plant fence-row to fence-row. Land that had been selling for $500 an acre was suddenly $1,000, then $1,500. Optimism, fueled by easy credit, swept through the heartland like a prairie fire. Dale Peterson was the poster child for the new era. He used his new 4630 as collateral to buy the 80 acres bordering him to the north. Before the ink was dry on that loan, he bought a brand new Gleaner M2 combine, a silver beast that could harvest 8 rows of corn at a time, twice what my old International could handle. He was the first in the county to put up a harvestor silo, its blue enamel shining like a beacon of prosperity. At the diner, he held court, talking about futures markets, expansion, and interest rates. He drove a new Lincoln Town car, and his wife wore clothes from the department store in Cedar Rapids, not the feed mill. He'd drive by my place and see me out on my old farmall, cultivating my corn, and just shake his head. When he saw me finally get the Dozer moving, he stopped his truck one afternoon. "Finally got the relic running, huh, Miller?" he shouted over the roar of the Detroit. "She moves," I yelled back. "Good for you. While you're playing in the dirt with your toys, I just closed on the Henderson place, another 200 acres. The bank is practically begging me to take their money." He laughed, a confident, booming sound. "You should get in on it, Frank. A man can't get rich on 160 acres. You're farming like it's 1950. He gunned his engine and peeled away, leaving me in his dust once more. He was right about one thing. I wasn't trying to get rich. I was trying to get free. While Dale and the others were expanding, I was improving. That summer, I put the dozer to work on the 40 acres of swamp. The work was brutal. The Detroit engine screamed at full power for 10 hours a day, burning 30 gallons of diesel that I could barely afford. The noise was relentless, a constant hammering roar that left my ears ringing for hours after I shut it down. I started at the edge, pushing over cottonwoods as thick as my chest. The dozer would shudder and groan, the tracks slipping in the mud, but the old machine would not quit. I'd lower the blade, dig into the root ball, and push with everything that 10 tons of steel had to give until the tree finally gave way with a splintering crash. Then I'd push the fallen trees and brush into massive piles to burn later. The worst part was the stumps and rocks. I'd hit a buried boulder and the dozer would lurch to a dead stop, throwing me against the control levers. I spent days digging around them, chaining them up, and slowly, painstakingly dragging them out of the muck. I was creating farmland from wilderness, foot by agonizing foot. By the end of that first summer, I had cleared 10 acres. It was a muddy, ugly patch of ground, dotted with craters where the stumps had been. But it was mine, and it was paid for. The next year, 1974, prices went even higher. Dale bought another tractor, an International 1066, and rented another 300 acres. He was farming nearly 1,000 acres now, a massive operation built on a mountain of debt. He was hailed as a visionary, a prime example of the modern, aggressive American farmer. The local banker would point him out as a success story. Meanwhile, I was still on my original 160, plus the 20 acres of swampland I'd managed to clear and tile. I used the money from the high grain prices not to buy new equipment, but to pay down my mortgage. I made double, sometimes triple payments. Every spare dollar went to the bank, chipping away at the principal. I was still driving the old Ford truck. I was still using my father's aging equipment. To everyone else, I looked like I was falling behind, a timid fool who was missing the opportunity of a lifetime. They saw my patched-up machinery and my small acreage and saw failure. They didn't see the rich black soil I was uncovering. They didn't see the mortgage balance shrinking every month. By the fall of 1978, I had cleared 35 of the 40 acres. The land, left fallow for a year to settle, was now the most productive ground on my farm. The corn grew taller and greener there than anywhere else. I had paid off the last of the loan for the generator engine and the truck batteries. The dozer, which I had painstakingly sanded and repainted in its original Alice Chalmers yellow, sat gleaming by the barn, a testament to my stubbornness. And most importantly, I was just 2 years away from paying off the entire farm. One crisp October evening, I was standing at the edge of my new field, looking out over the rows of ripened soybeans. The setting sun cast a golden light over everything. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, of peace. Then I heard the rumble of a diesel engine and saw the headlights of Dale's newest purchase, a massive 4-wheel-drive Steiger tractor pulling a 24-foot disc. He was working his land late into the night, trying to keep up with the demands of his sprawling empire. I watched him for a while, the big tractor looking like an insect crawling across the vast landscape under the twilight sky. On the radio, the news was no longer about record grain prices. The reports were filled with talk of an oil embargo, of hostages in Iran, of something called stagflation. The Federal Reserve Chairman, a man named Paul Volcker, was talking about a new, aggressive strategy to fight inflation. He was going to raise interest rates. A cold wind blew across my new field, rustling the dry soybean leaves. It sounded like a whisper of warning. Dale Peterson was farming 1,000 acres he didn't truly own, with machines bought with money he hadn't yet earned. I looked at my small, debt-free patch of earth, created by a machine everyone else had called junk. A knot of unease tightened in my gut. The loud, frantic boom times were coming to an end, and I had a terrible feeling that a long, hard silence was about to fall across the heartland. The whispers of warning on the wind became a steady murmur, and then a roar that drowned out everything else. The year 1980 dawned not with promise, but with a hard, metallic edge. The news from the cities was all about inflation, interest rates climbing like a runaway freight train on a mountain grade. The prime rate, a number we farmers had never paid much attention to, was suddenly the topic of every conversation at the feed mill. 10%, 12, 15. Each new number was a hammer blow to the foundation of the new prosperity. Then the sky turned against us. Spring came late and dry. The summer that followed was a biblical plague of heat. The sun rose each morning as a white, angry eye in a hazy sky and beat down relentlessly. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high by July, was stunted and yellow, its leaves curling inward during the day as if in prayer for a rain that never came. The ground in my fields, the rich black loam I had fought for, cracked open in patterns like broken pottery. My old farmall M, pulling the cultivator, raised clouds of fine brown dust that coated my skin and gritted in my teeth. While my crops suffered, Dale Peterson's were dying. He was farming so much land, much of it marginal hill ground he'd rented, that it baked hard as brick. His big new machines sat idle for weeks, their massive tires sinking into the powdery soil. There was no point in burning the fuel. The first real crack in his empire appeared not in the fields, but in his machine shed. One sweltering August afternoon, I saw his big Steiger tractor, the four-wheel drive monster, being loaded onto a lowboy trailer from the dealership. The next time I saw Dale at the diner, his usual bravado was gone, replaced by a brittle defensive anger. "Transmission," he grumbled into his coffee cup, not looking at anyone. "Planetary gears went out in the final drive. Can you believe it? Machine's only 3 years old." "Parts expensive?" someone asked cautiously. Dale let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Expensive. They want $12,000. 12. And they won't touch it until I pay for the parts up front." "Cash," said, "my line of credit with them is frozen." The bank froze it. A heavy silence fell over the counter. $12,000 was more than my father had paid for our entire farm. It was a sum that was simply impossible to produce when you had no crop to sell and a bank that had turned off the tap. Dale's Steiger sat at the dealership for the rest of the year, a green monument to the new reality. He had to hire a neighbor to do his full tillage, paying him with a portion of the meager crop he managed to harvest. My own farm was hurting, but it wasn't bleeding. The bottomland, that reclaimed swamp, was my salvation. Its deep soil held moisture long after the hills had burned up. My corn there was shorter than usual, the ears not as full, but it was a crop. It was something. My old International 560 broke down twice during harvest, a bearing going out in the final drive, but I didn't have to call a dealer. I drove to Earl's salvage yard, found a used bearing for $20, and spent a night under the machine with a greasy set of wrenches, fixing it myself. My hands were my line of credit. By 1981, the farm crisis was no longer a threat. It was a war of attrition. Interest rates hit 20%. Commodity prices, which had been our rocket fuel, collapsed. Corn that had been $3 a bushel was suddenly worth less than $2. Land values plummeted. Farmers who had borrowed 80 cents on every dollar of land value suddenly owed more than their farms were worth. The phone started ringing at all hours in our house, but it was rarely for us. It was neighbors. Desperate men, their voices tight with panic, asking if I had a spare hydraulic pump, if I could weld a broken axle, if I could lend them a few $100s for fuel until their government checks came in. I helped where I could, offering my tools, my time, my welding skills, but I couldn't lend money I barely had. Dale Peterson stopped coming to the diner altogether. His farm began to look neglected. Weeds grew along his fence rows. A broken gate on his feedlot was tied shut with baling wire. The shiny blue harvestor silo, once his proudest achievement, stood half empty, a symbol of a promise the bank had rescinded. He had been forced to sell off most of his cattle herd to make an interest payment. One evening, Mary told me his wife had come by while I was out. She hadn't asked for anything, not directly. She just wanted to know if we had any extra green beans from our garden. Mary had filled 2 grocery sacks for her, adding in potatoes and tomatoes and a dozen eggs. When she told me, I saw tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't pity, it was a deep, profound sorrow for what was happening to our community, to our way of life. The high times had pitted us against each other, made us rivals. The hard times were reminding us that we were all neighbors, all tied to the same land and the same fate. The turning point, the moment the last illusion of hope shattered, came in the spring of 1982. I was in my machine shed, grinding the valves on the farmall's engine, when I saw Dale's dusty Lincoln pull into my driveway. He got out slowly, like an old man. He had lost weight, and his face was a drawn, grey mask of exhaustion. He didn't look at me, but at the big yellow Dozer parked beside the shed. "Miller," he said, his voice a dry rasp. I need a favor." I shut off the grinder and wiped my hands on a rag. "What is it, Dale?" He swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on a bolt on the Dozer's blade. "The bank. They're calling my note, all of it. I have to come up with $50,000 by the end of the month, or they'll start foreclosure proceedings." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were hollow. "I know you've been paying down your place. I know you're not in deep like the rest of us. I was wondering if you could co-sign a note for me. Just a short-term loan. To get the bank off my back until prices come back up." I looked at him, at the man who had mocked me, who had called my work a folly, who had represented everything I had fought against. And I felt no triumph. I only felt a vast, aching sadness. "Dale," I said, my voice gentle, "you know I can't do that. It wouldn't do you any good. The bank wouldn't accept it. And prices aren't coming back up, not for a long time." He flinched as if I'd struck him. He stared at me for a long moment, the silence stretching between us. He was looking for the smugness, the satisfaction he would have shown me had our positions been reversed. He didn't find it. He just nodded, a single jerky motion, and turned without another word. He got in his car and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust to hang in the still air. I knew then that it was over for him. The empire built on credit had crumbled. The auctioneer's voice was different this time. It wasn't Gus's booming, jovial bellow. It was a flat, monotone recitation of terms and conditions read by a grim-faced man in a suit from the bank. The crowd was different too. It was larger than the one at the Henderson sale a decade earlier, but it was quiet. Deathly quiet. There was no laughter, no friendly banter. Farmers stood in small, silent groups, their hands in their pockets, their faces grim. They weren't here as vultures, they were here as mourners, paying their last respects to a fallen neighbor, knowing full well it could be their turn next. It was a cold, grey day in November of 1983. 10 years, almost to the day, since I had bought my Dozer. We stood in the shadow of Dale Peterson's machine shed, surrounded by the machinery that had been his pride and joy. The John Deere 4630, its sound guard cab now dusty, its tires weathered. The massive Gleaner M2 combine, its silver paint peeling slightly at the seams. The International 1066. The Lincoln Town car. It was a whole life, spread out for inspection, tagged with lot numbers. Dale was there, standing with his wife and 2 young sons near the farmhouse. He looked like a ghost, his eyes vacant, staring at nothing. His wife held his arm, her face a stoic, tearless mask of grief. The banker started with the big items first, hoping to draw some high bids. The Steiger, finally repaired, was up first. A decade ago, it would have started a bidding war. Now the auctioneer pleaded for an opening bid of $20,000 on a machine that had cost Dale over $100,000. Silence. He dropped it to 15, then 10. Finally, a corporate farm buyer from another state, a man no one knew, bought it for $8,000, a fraction of what was still owed on it. One by one, the machines went. The Gleaner combine sold for less than the price of a new pickup truck. The 4630 bought by the same corporate farmer for a pittance. Each sale was another nail in the coffin. The local men, the ones who had once envied Dale, couldn't bid. They had no cash, and no bank would lend them a dime. They just watched, their faces etched with fear and a dawning understanding. They were watching their own future being sold off. I stayed through it all. I didn't bid on any of the big equipment. I had no need for it and no desire to pick over the bones of Dale's dream. My own survival felt less like a victory and more like a fluke, a consequence of my own stubbornness and my father's ingrained fear of debt. While Dale had been chasing the horizon, I had been digging in, securing my small perimeter. My farm was an island in a sea of red ink. My harvest that year was small, the price I got for it was terrible, but when it was all sold, the money was mine. I had no interest payments to make that were larger than my income. I paid my property taxes, bought my seed and fuel for the next year, and we lived on the rest. We were poor, but we were free. The old Dozer was the key. When my neighbor's planter broke down, I used it to haul the broken frame back to his shop where we could weld it. When the creek flooded and washed out the culvert on the county road, I spent 2 days in the operator's seat, clearing the debris and rebuilding the crossing so the school bus could get through. Frank's Folly had become a community asset. It ran on cheap diesel and my own labor, a currency that was still sound when the dollar was not. The auction ended as the sun began to set, casting long, sorrowful shadows across the yard. The corporate buyers loaded up their spoils. The crowd quietly dispersed, heading back to their own threatened farms. The banker, looking unsatisfied with the day's take, strode to his car and left. Soon it was just me and the Peterson family, left alone in the wreckage. I walked over to where Dale was standing. He didn't look up. "I'm sorry, Dale," I said. It was all I could think of to say. He shook his head, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "You told me, didn't you? You and your junk pile." He gestured vaguely toward my farm. "You were right. My dad, he farmed 80 acres his whole life, never owed a man a thing. I thought he was a fool, an old-timer who was afraid of progress." He finally looked at me, his eyes swimming with a pain so deep it was terrifying. He was the smart one. I'm the fool. He was a broken man. The arrogance had been stripped away, layer by layer, by the market, by the weather, by the bank, until all that was left was the raw, aching core of a man who had lost everything. I knew what was coming next. The bank owned it all now, including the original 80 acres that had been his father's, the piece of land where his house stood. They would be evicted within 30 days. Thrown off the land his family had worked for 3 generations. I had spent the last week on the phone with the only banker who would still talk to me, the elderly president of a small savings and loan in a neighboring town, a man who had known my father. I had walked him through my finances, my yields from the reclaimed land, my lack of debt. It was the biggest risk of my life, going back into debt after I had fought so hard to get out. But it wasn't the same. This wasn't a gamble on a rising market. It was an investment in a neighbor. "The bank is putting the house and the home 80 up for sale next week, Dale," I said quietly. "They'll take 30,000 for it, just to clear it off their books." He just stared at me, his expression uncomprehending. "I'm buying it," I said. His face hardened. "You? So you can plow under my home? So you can stand on my porch and laugh about how right you were?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'm buying it so you and your family can stay here. You can rent it from me. $100 a year. You farm it, you keep the profits. You maintain the house. When you get back on your feet, you can buy it back from me for exactly what I paid for it. Not a penny more." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. His wife, who had been listening, let out a small sob and covered her face with her hands. Dale's eyes, for the first time that day, filled with tears. He tried to speak, but no words came out. He just stood there, under the cold grey sky, a proud man shattered, and then, in the space of a single breath, offered a sliver of grace he had never expected and felt he didn't deserve. He didn't have to accept my charity. But in that moment, we both knew he would. It was the only way he could keep his family in their home, on the land that was in their blood. My victory wasn't in being right, it was in being able to offer a hand to a man who had fallen. The years that followed were lean, but the bleeding had stopped. The farm crisis scoured the Midwest, taking with it a generation of farmers who had bet on the promise of perpetual growth. Foreclosure signs became as common as mailboxes. But a new kind of community rose from the ashes. We learned to rely on each other again. We traded work, shared equipment, and bartered for repairs. We learned to be mechanics, welders, and accountants. We learned the hard lessons of thrift and self-reliance that our grandfathers had known. Dale and I became friends. It wasn't an easy friendship at first, shadowed as it was by the ghosts of his failure and my quiet success. But working together healed the rift. We fixed his old machinery, keeping it running with salvaged parts and stubborn ingenuity. He farmed his 80 acres, and I farmed my 200. We helped each other at planting and harvest. The condescension in his voice was replaced by a quiet respect. He taught my son, Ben, how to read the markets, and I taught his boys how to rebuild a carburetor. By 1989, the worst was over. Land prices began to stabilize. Dale, through sheer hard work and a decade of frugal living, had saved enough money. He came to my house one evening, a cashier's check in his hand, and bought his farm back. We shook hands on the porch, two middle-aged men who had been to hell and back. There were no grand speeches, none were needed. My son, Ben, grew up in the shadow of the crisis. He never knew the heady days of the boom. He knew only the value of a dollar earned and the importance of a machine you could fix yourself. He spent his childhood in the machine shed with me, his hands perpetually stained with grease. He learned the growl of the Farmall's engine, the clatter of the old International Combine, and the earth-shaking roar of the Detroit diesel in the Alice Chalmers. One cool autumn afternoon, when Ben was 16, we were standing on the hill overlooking the bottomland. The fields were a patchwork of gold and brown, ready for harvest. The old Dozer was parked near the barn, its yellow paint faded by the sun, a few streaks of rust beginning to show again. It hadn't done any heavy work in years, but I started it every month just to keep it alive. "Dad," Ben said, "why'd you ever buy that old thing? Everyone said you were crazy." I looked at the machine, a 10-ton piece of my own history. "Everyone was looking at the rust," I said. "They saw a worn-out blade and a busted engine. They saw what it was. I tried to see what it could be, and what it could do." I pointed down to the fields below us, the richest land on our farm, land that had once been a tangled swamp. "That machine didn't just clear that land, Ben. It kept us free. In the good times, everyone thought the new, big stuff was the answer. They borrowed and spent and got bigger and bigger. But they weren't owners anymore. They were just managers for the bank. Their payments owned them. That Dozer, it was ugly and loud and hard to work on. But it was mine. It didn't come with a payment book. And because it was mine, this land is ours." He was quiet for a long time, looking from the Dozer to the fields, the pieces of the story clicking into place in his mind. He was understanding that it was never about the machine itself. It was about a choice. The choice between being a master of your own small world or a servant in a much larger one. I still farm this land. I'm older now, my hands scarred and stiff. Ben farms alongside me. We have a newer tractor, one with a cab and a radio, but it's a modest one and it's paid for. The old Farmall M is still in the shed, polished and proud, for light work and tractor parades, and the Dozer still sits by the barn. Sometimes, on a quiet evening, I'll walk out and lay a hand on its cold steel track. I remember the ridicule, the back-breaking labor, the roar of the engine that filled my world for so many years. That engine brought the loudest, most violent noise I had ever known into my life. But what it left behind, what it carved out of the wilderness and the debt, was a profound and lasting silence, the silence of a field at dusk, the silence of a paid-off mortgage, the silence of a free man on his own land. And that is the sweetest sound of all.